everybody, and welcome to the second edition of the API Platform Conference. First, thank you, Grégoire, thank you, Cécile, and thank you, Oriane, for all the work regarding the organization. My talk of today will be about the brand new major version of API Platform, API Platform 3.0. As most people in this city, I guess my first name is Kevin. And I will try to explain you first the new design decisions that we made when working on the version 3 of the framework. Secondly, how we improve the developer experience when using API Platform. The work that has been done on the JavaScript part of the framework that has been improved a lot. And finally, we will speak about the new roadmap of the project. But we have a problem. We are a bit late. API Platform 3 has been announced a year ago. And if you go on the GitHub page of the project, you can see that version 3.0 has still not been released. It starts to be a major issue because all the conference is about this new version, but it's not ready. The problem is mostly due to my friend Antoine Blucher, who is the main developer of API Platform 3. So Antoine will come on stage and we will try to fix our mistake and we will try to release the new major version of API Platform. So Antoine, it's up to you.
Hi.
When releasing API Platform, obviously, there are a lot of things to do. Most of the things have already been done, and if you follow our repositories on GitHub, you've seen a lot of activities these days, because API Platform is made of many, many components, the main ones, but also tiny repositories that you can find on GitHub. And to release a new major of the full framework, we need to tag all the components. And to do that, we need to be sure that all the components are working properly and that they are working properly all together in the API Platform distribution. So obviously, we will not do all this work on stage today. Most of this has already been done, but two things haven't. When we tag a new major version, or actually a new minor too, what we have to do mostly is to test that everything is working properly. So we test using our automated test suite, but also manually because we can always miss some problems. Tests are code, and in code there are bugs. We already did this work, obviously. Another very time-consuming task is to update the documentation. This has been done too, and to work on the marketing things like writing blog posts and publishing tweets and things like that. This is not done. We will do that after the conference. After that, we have to tag tens of packages in JavaScript, in Go, in PHP, Docker files. There are many, many, many things to build the API Platform distribution. And when all the packages are released, then we can update the main API Platform repository, the distribution, which is the skeleton that you use to start a new API Platform project. And it contains references to all the other API Platform packages, basically.
So, Kevin, could you please open a terminal? And we will actually release API Platform 3. So the first thing we need to do is we need to tag the core library, which is the main PHP library. So first you need to check that we didn't added anything. And for this version, we are going to tag a 2.7 version, which is the next minor without breaking changes and deprecations. I will talk about this more tomorrow. So the -s is to be sure that it's Kevin that is signing it and not some imposter. So now that we tagged the 2.7, we are going to go to the main branch. He's fetching it just in case I added a latest patch yesterday night, which was not the case, so that's good. And we can now tag the new main version. The last thing we need to do is create a new 3.0 branch on our repository, because this will be where we do the next features. Now he just push the core library, so on packages in a few minutes you should see the new API platform core version. Last thing we need to do, we are going to need to update what we call the distribution. The distribution is what you use to create a new API platform project, right? And because you create a new project, we will add the new API version 3 version on this distribution. So you updated composer.json yet? That's the missing part. So we need to go on our distribution repository, find the core library. You see that we tested with dev main branch. And here we are going to use the new 3.0 version. Now that's done, we need to do a composer update. You see that it's already released. No security vulnerability advisory found. That's nice. And we can tag the distribution. We push the tags and it's done. API Platform 3 is finally released after 1 year. Thank you.
Okay, so to celebrate, in the evening, come at the API Platform release party, and be sure of one thing, the talk of Kevin will be great because he is speaking before the party. So don't miss Kevin's talk, and I'm not lying, most people in this city has Kevin as first name, as you can see. So let's talk a bit about what's new in API Platform 3. So first, we took some time to discuss and to think about how to improve the developer experience of the framework and how to make it more standard compliant. You know that we care a lot about standards with, in the API Platform team. When we work on something new in API Platform, we always try to remember what are the core values of the framework. And these core values are that the framework must be as easy to use as possible. So when you get started with API Platform, you must be able to create very quickly a working project. The web API and the client tools that will consume the web API, basically your website or your native mobile app. So it's the main thing that we try to do. In a few minutes, you should be able to prototype something. At the same time, when your project will grow, you should be able to follow more advanced architectures. And with the same framework, with the same tool, you should be able to extend everything and to plug more advanced custom logics and get rid of the rapid application development methodology and switch to things such as domain-driven design or clean architecture or microservices using the same tool. So it's not quite easy to do, but I think that with API Platform 3, we have something nice about that. Another key point of the framework is that it's something batteries included. That means that if you want to build an API, or if you want to create front-end applications that will consume an API, you should be able to do that very, very easily with API Platform and have all the main expected features working out of the box. For instance, when you start your new API Platform project, you get instantly filtering, ordering, pagination, and HTTP cache, and many, many other things. And the last thing is that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to follow as closely as possible the existing web standards and use as much as possible the web stack. So when we try to build a new feature, the first thing that we always do is that we check if there is an existing standard from the W3C or from the IETF about this feature, and if it exists, we try to implement this standard so we are out of the box, interoperable with other tools in other ecosystems. In version 2 of API Platform, there were some pain points. The main pain point that we identified was the support of what we call sub-resources. That means when you have a resource which is part of a broader resource. For instance, you have a user which is a member of an organization, and this resource makes no sense outside of this organization context. This kind of resources was already supported in API Platform 3, but to be honest, that wasn't very well designed. It was only supported for get methods, not in write. It was very hard to customize. And it's a shame because it's one of the main points of the REST architecture, and we are a REST framework. Also, it's very hard to implement the edge-side API architecture that I presented during the API Platform conference in 2021. The main idea behind this architecture is to leverage HTTP 2 and HTTP 3 and to serve small resources, atomic resources with your API that will be linked together and that will have a very good cache dynamic. Thanks to HTTP 2 and HTTP 3, we will be able to download these resources in parallel most of the time. To do that, to have small resources with linked together, you need sub-resources. That has been fixed in API Platform 3. The second problem that we identified that was most people using the framework were badly hooking their custom logic. So the framework were already supporting a proper way to write advanced design patterns such as CQRS or to write DDD applications and things like that. But most of the time when we audited some codes using API Platform, it wasn't done properly. So in API Platform 3, we decided to improve this kind the experience for this kind of use cases, and to make it very clear how you should hook your custom logic when you have some advanced use cases. And finally, for big projects, the configuration using doctrine annotation can become very, very huge and verbose. It wasn't very practical. Fortunately, PHP evolved, and there are support for native attributes which are way better in API in PHP 8 and 8.1. We redesigned all the configuration system and all the internals of API Platform to leverage these new attributes. So in API Platform version 3, we fixed most of these issues and many other issues, by the way. We also used our dependencies. We also upgraded our dependencies to use the latest and the greatest features provided by PHP, the language that we use for the server part. Symfony, because we use a lot of Symfony components inside of API Platform, but also all other dependencies of the distribution. Docker, Next.js, KDE, all of these tools are evolving very fastly, and we upgraded all these tools, and we used the latest and great features introduced in recent versions of these tools. We also tried to be as close as possible of some open standards, especially RDF. We will talk a bit about these standards later, and OpenAPI. So the new way of creating an API platform, API with API Platform 3, is more or less writing a RDF or an OpenAPI document, but in PHP. We will see that in a few seconds. And finally, we took the opportunity to remove all the legacy code that were making the code base hard to maintain and hard to read. For API Platform 3, we used some interesting standards. The first one is Resource Description Format, RDF, which is basically the data model of the web that is standardized by the W3C. It's part of what we call the semantic web or the Web 3.0. Who in this room is already using RDF? Okay, if you are using API Platform version 1 or 2, you are already using RDF because JSON LD, which is a serialization format of RDF, is basically a format to serialize RDF documents. In API Platform 3, we are even closer of the specification than we were before. RDF allows you to describe your data model, the data model, the public data model that you will expose to your application using things that are quite popular for object-oriented programmers, even if this format is graph-oriented. You have classes, you have properties, you have links, you have a good type system. So it looks like PHP classes, maybe a bit, we will see that. Another very interesting standard, if you are a web developer, is URLs or URIs. It's the identifier system of the web. When you create a web API or a website, you are exposing resources through the network. These resources must have identifiers. The identifiers of the resources are the URLs. There is an interesting related standard from the IETF called URI template. Basically, it's a pattern system allowing to generate URLs from variables. In these examples, we have two variables in the template, OID and UID, the organization ID and the user ID. And we can pass some data to replace these variables by the actual values. In API Platform 3, we use these three standards a lot. From the beginning, API Platform was a resource-oriented framework. That means that the first step that you have to do when you start a new project with API Platform, when you are building your new API, is to design the public data model that you will expose through your API. The public one, not the one of your database system, not your business logic that will be purely internal. It's the shape of the JSON documents or XML documents or whatever that you will expose to the API. In API Platform 3, we propose to use the PHP language as a documentation language for the public data model that you will expose to the API. Basically, that means that you will create a class describing the shape of the JSON documents that you will expose to the API. You could do that using OpenAPI, for instance, by writing by yourself a YAML document. PHP is more expressive than YAML, so it will be easier. And there are a lot of new features in the language, especially regarding the type system, making it a good tool to describe some data that you will expose. So the mental process that you should have when you start using API Platform is basically documenting your API by describing as a set of PHP classes the documents that you will expose to the API. So here I want to expose the user through an API, and I have a class describing this user as it will be used by JavaScript developers, by client-side developers. These classes will also be used as DTOs. So basically, when you will receive a request on the API, API Platform will take care of transforming, of deserializing the JSON document in an object of this type. And it also works for read request. When a user will send a GET request to your API, API Platform will call your business logic, call your persistent system to fetch the data. You will have to return an instance of this class, and API Platform will serialize this class as a JSON document. So API Platform 3 provides the infrastructure layer of your API, and that's all. you can have any internal data model. The internal data model of your API doesn't have to use this class. This class doesn't have to be mapped with the doctrine ORM. You can have a public data model, let's say something in English because we are modern, mapped on a legacy database that will use columns in French because it's an old system. It's something that it's totally acceptable and totally designed for in API Platform version 3. So you describe as a set of PHP classes the public resources that you want to expose to the API, and automatically API Platform expose for you a stable and state-of-the-art REST API. If you install an extra library, you can also, with the exact same code, get a valid GraphQL API. API Platform will use these public classes to generate documentation for your API. Machine-readable documentation using OpenAPI, and to be precise, the latest version of OpenAPI, which is version 3.1. And we will also describe RDF documentations for your API using the Hydra vocabulary. And we will also automatically expose human-readable documentations using popular open source software, especially Swagger UI for the OpenAPI documentation and GraphIQL for GraphQL. Also, you will get a working API. Using these metadata, using these classes, API Platform will register all the roots of your API and will take care of serializing and deserializing the data. The API that will be exposed by default will implement the most modern standards. By default, it will be JSON LD with Hydra, but you can also switch if you want to, or to other popular formats such as JSON API or HAL or GraphQL. And you can even use all of them together on the same API with the exact same code. There is another very interesting new feature in API Platform 3. Instead of creating the PHP classes describing the public data model of your API by yourself, you can also write what we call an RDF vocabulary to describe the resources that you want to expose. So you have some tools like Expose to do that, and you can use some open formats to do that, so as all. There are also a lot of existing vocabularies for many, many fields that you can reuse, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel, even regarding the data model. For instance, the most popular RDF vocabulary is schema.org, which contains types for many popular internet use cases. The NASA is providing another RDF vocabulary that you can use if you are working in the space or in the plane field. And then you already get a standard and interoperable data model. And in API Platform 3, we also added support for another popular tool, which is the OpenAPI specification language. And now, if you document your future API using OpenAPI, formerly known as Swagger, then you can just use the YAML OpenAPI specification and generate the PHP classes that will be used by API Platform to expose your new web API. OpenAPI, there is a huge OpenAPI ecosystem. And for instance, there is a tool called Stoplight, which allows to design a web API visually. So using this tool, you can describe your types, describe the classes, the properties of your classes, the URLs and everything, basically, the links between the resources, and you export an OpenAPI file. Now, you can go on Stoplight, design visually your web API, export the file, run the generator, you get a brand new API that is working. So we improved the metadata system. We leveraged PHP 8.1 attributes. And there are many, many new features in API Platform 3. Basically, we now use URI templates for everything, so you get full control on the URL of your resources. Sub-resources have been removed, but the new resource system allows to do the same thing, but using all the standard features of API Platform and all the new features that we added in API Platform 3. And now, for your sub-resources, there is write support. Also, we changed the metadata system to be as close as possible from RDF and OpenAPI. And now you can put RDF types and RDF annotations and OpenAPI properties directly into the PHP attributes. There is a lot there is a lot to say about that. There is many new features, as you can see on this slide. Don't miss Antoine's talk tomorrow morning. It will cover all these features in depth. Now that we have a working API, there is still one thing missing. We get some data from the user, but what do we do with this data? You need to do something with this data. To do that, you need to plug your custom business logic, or at least to plug a persistent system, a database, to store the data somewhere. With API Platform 3, we made it very easy to hook custom business logic, especially if you are following advanced architectures such as DDD or clean architecture, or hexagonal architectures, and things like that. There is two new concepts, providers and processors. Directly on your resource class, you can set a service that will be used as provider to fetch the data from your domain, from your database, that will be serialized by API Platform. And you can set a processor service to call some code that will have access to the data sent by the user through a post or a put request, for instance. So, by implementing this very simple interface, you can call your database or call your domain, call your internal types, your doctrine entities that will not leak publicly, hydrate the DTO that we marked with the API resource annotation, return that, and that's working. I say DTO for the class marked with the API resource annotation. The old, badly designed DTO feature of API Platform 2 is gone. Now, the DTO, the only DTO, is your main class, the class that describes the public data model that you will expose to your API. It's almost the same thing for the processor. When you receive a post request, for instance, or a put or a delete request, API Platform will transform the payload, the JSON document, for instance, into an instance of the PHP class marked with the API resource annotation, and it will pass it to the processor. You will also have access to some context, including the URL and the variables. Using this object, you can persist it somewhere in your database, or you can transform it in some internal object and pass it to your domain if you are following more advanced architectures. Robin Chalas and Matthias Arlo will explain you how to follow the domain-driven design architecture using this brand new system tomorrow. So if you want more details about this new feature, today. Sorry. So it will be a big day. Anyway, if you just want to create a CRUD API and you want to prototype something very quickly and you don't care about DDD, it's most of my projects, so I don't want to get that out of API Platform. The old way of just mapping a doctrine entity as an API resource still works. So if you just want to persist and to have write support for your object, just map it with the doctrine ORM and it works. We also support MongoDB if you prefer to use MongoDB instead of a relational database. And for GET request, we still support Elasticsearch. Even better, you can mix both approaches you can mix both approaches in the same project. That means that if, let's say, 80% of your resources are standard CRUD resources, then you can use the same class that you will map as an API platform resource and as a doctrine entity. So you will share the same class for the public and the internal data model of your application, and that will work without any extra line of code. But for 20% of your application, usually the main entities, you want to do something more complex. Just persisting the public data model into your internal database is not good enough. Then, just for these resources, you can use the new processor and provider system and hook some custom code in the same project. That's all for the core component, the API component of API platform. Let's speak a bit about the other components. We worked hard in API platform 3 to improve, again, the developer experience. We changed almost everything regarding how we use Docker. As you may know, Docker released new versions of Docker itself using BuildKit, which is way faster and have a lot of new features, and of Docker Compose. For API Platform version 3, we use Docker Compose version 2 and BuildKit to improve the developer experience. So now, when you use the distribution, it will be way faster than before, both in development, especially if you are using Mac or Windows, and in production. We improved a lot our Kubernetes configuration to deploy your project in production with Kubernetes, and we use the new features provided by the KDE web server, and Francis will show you some of these new features during the conference. We upgraded to the latest version of KDE that is now the web server of choice for API platform, and it is shipped in the distribution. Another nice thing there now is native support for Xdebug. Xdebug is a very popular step-by-step debugger for PHP. Now, if you want to enable the step-by-step debugger, you just have to set a single environment variable, xdebug mode equal debug. You launch, you start Docker Compose, and everything is working. If you are using PHP Storm, at least, you can set a breakpoint and debug your code. There is nothing more to do. As you probably know, API platforms has integrations with various front-end frameworks. So there is some tools that are able to parse the API documentation and to generate applications using popular front-end technologies. The framework of choice that we recommend is Next.js, which is the most popular front-end framework, basically built on top of React. We improved a lot the Next.js integration in API Platform 3. We improved the Docker setup for the Next.js part, and it's now faster than before. And we used the new features provided by the latest version of Next.js to improve the performance, especially in production, and to reduce the size of the Docker images, both locally and in production. Speaking about JavaScript and of the standalone tools, the client-side tools of API platform, a lot of work has also been done regarding these components, especially by Alan Poulin, so thanks to Alan. First, we have this component, the API platform admin component. Basically, this component is able to make a query to the API, retrieve the machine-readable API documentation, and dynamically build a B2B-like interface for the data exposed to your API. So there is a single line of code, a single React component, and you get a working administration for your data. This tool is existing for a long time, but it was tied to API platform server component. That's not the case anymore. In API Platform 3, we added support for OpenAPI and a better support for Hydra in this tool. And now you can use API Platform admin with any API, even if it's not written with the API platform server component, as long as this API is documented using a recent version of OpenAPI. API platform is also a real-time framework. There is a talk from Pauline about that. I don't remember if it's today or tomorrow, but don't miss it. By default, when you are exposing an API platform API, when some changes are made to the data stored server side, API platform will send events to all the connected clients in real time. So clients will have the opportunity to subscribe to updates and to update the data on screen in real time. In API Platform 3, we improved API Platform Admin to leverage this feature. That means that when you have a page open in the admin, if the data changed because another user is editing something, the UI updates instantly and you see the change in real time. We did almost the same thing for the create client component. Actually, it was named Client Generator in API Platform 2, but we renamed it to use a feature of NPM and Yarn, allowing to call the tool without installing it locally. So this tool is able to parse an API documentation and generate scaffold projects using popular JavaScript frameworks. By default, out of the box, it supports Next.js, Nuxt.js for Vue, Quasar, Vuetify, React Native if you want to build native mobile applications, and some other ecosystems. For instance, there is a Rust type generator that is documented. And you can also write your own skeletons to generate your own front-end applications. For instance, we have some customers using their own JavaScript frameworks, and they have created their own skeletons to be able to very easily generate the front-end application, or at least the skeleton of the front-end application, when they add a new resource to their API. This tool has been improved a lot, and it also gains support for OpenAPI. That means that now you can use this generator for Next.js, Vue, etc. with any API, as long as it is documented using OpenAPI. We also improved most of the skeletons to use TypeScript instead of JavaScript and to support Mercure, so the same real-time capabilities as with API Platform Admin. One more thing about API Platform. It has been very long to release API Platform 3. It has been too long to release API Platform 3, actually. So sorry about that, but as you have seen in the beginning of the talk, it's quite some work, and we are doing it mostly for free, so it's a bit complicated. Anyway, it is done. We decided to change the roadmap to improve the situation. So starting today, we will release a new version of API Platform, a new major version of API Platform, every 2 years. We cannot tell you what will be in API Platform 4, what will be the new features. It will depend of what you will contribute to the framework. But what we can tell you now is that in 2 years, regardless of the features, we will tag a new major version of API Platform. This new major version will not contain a backward compatibility layer with older versions. That means that we will remove all the legacy code. But as today, we will release 2 versions at the same time, last version for the API Platform 3 branch, and the exact same code without the backward compatibility layer, but containing all the new features as a new major version. So you have 1 version to upgrade. Also, this new major version will only support the latest stable version of Symfony. That means that we will not support in the next major version of API Platform the LTS versions of Symfony. I will explain that a bit more in the next slide. In addition to this new major version, we will also publish a new minor version every 6 months. As I was already explaining, you will have an upgrade path. when we will release API Platform 3.4. We will also release API Platform 4.0, as we did previously with 2.7 and 3.0. And both versions will be exactly the same thing, except that in API Platform 4.0, the legacy code will be removed, so it will not be compatible with features that have been deprecated in API Platform 3. So an example will maybe be a bit more clear. In September 2022, today, we have released API Platform 3 and API Platform 2.6. Next year, Symfony will release Symfony 7. When Symfony will release Symfony 7, we will release at the same time API Platform 3.2 that will be compatible with Symfony 6 LTS version and Symfony 7. 1 year after that, we will release a new major version of API Platform, API Platform 4.0. And at the same time, we will release the last version of the 3 branch, API Platform 3.4. API Platform 3.4 will contain a backward compatibility layer for all features that have been deprecated in API Platform 3 and all the new features of API Platform 4. So you can upgrade easily to the new features with this version. API Platform 3.4 will be compatible with Symfony 6 and Symfony 7. But API Platform 4 will not have the backward compatibility layer and will only be compatible with Symfony 7. And it will be the same thing every 2 years. We have no time for questions, but there is a Q&A session with the Symfony core team today at the end of the day, just before the party with all the Kevins of the city. So if you have questions about this talk, write them and ask during the evening. And thank you very much. Enjoy the conference. And enjoy API Platform 3. There is a hack day on Saturday. We tagged the new version. I'm pretty sure that there is already a lot of people that don't have tested the beta version and that are reporting a lot of issues. If you want to help fixing the issues that will be discovered today because we tagged the new stable version, don't hesitate to come to the hack day to help. Thank you.